Coming up on the GCN Racing news show this week, who really was the best sprinter of 2019? We've also got the Rectavit and World Cup Cyclocross action from the weekend. We take a quick look at the route of the 2020 Vuelta a España, and Jumbo Visma have announced their Tour de France squad, and it looks like we could finally have a squad to rival Team Ineos. We'll start though with the UCI Cyclocross World Cup in Namur. The event at the Citadel is a classic, even if it's only a decade old. Erwin Vervecken mentioned on our podcast that he had changed the design of the course to include a cobbled climb, a change which in fact had been met with some negative comments from the likes of Matthew's dad, Adrie van der Poel. The conditions on the day turned the course into one of those epic spectacles of all-out racing that we've seen in quite some time. The front of the women's race was an all-Dutch affair as it came down to a battle between Lucinda Brandt and Ceylin del Carmen Alvarado, who had outwitted her at the previous round in Koksijde. At the bottom of that tough cobble climb though, Brandt kicked and rode away to victory, whilst Alvarado hung on for second, with Anne-Marie Vorst rounding out the podium ahead of another former winner, Evie Richards. Finishing fifth though was enough to see Katarina Nash retain the World Cup lead. The men's race was one of the most spectacular battles that I've seen for quite some time. Those savage conditions just got worse and worse as the day went on. The man who ended the golden run of Van der Poel, Toon Aerts, had hit some incredible form, and what a race those two gave us. It swung backwards and forwards between the two, and there was more than one occasion during the race where it looked like the race had been won or indeed lost. In the end though, it took a big crash from Aerts on the final lap to decide that race. Clearly winded, and it took him a while to get going. Not long afterwards, Tom Pidcock also came down heavily in a very similar place, and that would cost him the third place on the day. Now, the emotion on the face of Matthew as he crossed the line showed just how much that victory meant to him, whilst Aerts hung on for second place, and Corne van Kessel rounded out the podium in third. Then, as the cameras went inside the tent where the podium riders were getting changed and getting warm after the race, you got a glimpse as to just how much those conditions had taken it out of them. Their faces were absolutely covered in mud. They were shivering, teeth chattering, and not just in there, but also through the entire presentation. Let's hope they got to enjoy some mulled wine and frites yesterday evening. Aerts has now taken over the lead in the World Cup standings, which he won overall last year. The former leader before the race, Elisabeth, was so cold mid-race that he stopped to put a jacket on in the pits. But even that didn't work though, and eventually he pulled out with mild hypothermia. And I think this picture, tweeted by Tom Pidcock, probably summarises how most of the riders out there were feeling on the day. Right, before we get on to our main talking point for this week's show, a quick look at what's coming up on the channel over the next 7 days. Busy one, starting on Boxing Day, Thursday, when we have the next round of the UCI World Cup in Zolder. No overindulging if you're a cyclocross rider, to say the least. We've got that race live in selected countries through Europe. Then the following day, on Friday, we've got the DVV Trophy. Sunday is the Super Prestige, both of those worldwide except Belgium and the Netherlands. And then this time next week, on Monday, we've got the Atheist Cross. That one is worldwide, excluding Belgium, the Netherlands, the USA and Canada. So, just who was the best sprinter of the 2019 season? Well, we've looked at all the bunch sprint finishes of the year, and we've got Cillian Kelly to crunch the numbers, and so the answer is, it depends. It just depends on which measure of success you decide is the most important. Quantity, quality, consistency, or some combination of all three. So, first up, let's take a look at the breakdown of the bunch sprinting performances of the 5 best this year. The rider who won the most bunch sprints in 2019 was Dylan Groenewegen with 15, 2 more than anybody else. The rider with the most bunch sprint podium places though was Pascal Ackermann of Bora Hansgrohe with 27, although depending on the circumstances that could be a measure of failure rather than success. Of those 5 sprinters, it was Sam Bennett who took the most wins in World Tour races, with 11 of his 12 sprint wins coming at the very highest level, the only exception to that being a stage of the Vuelta San Juan earlier on this year. And the rider with the most Grand Tour stage bunch sprint wins was Caleb Ewan. He took 5, 2 at the Giro and 3 at the Tour de France, which accounted for half of his total wins for the season. Ewan actually won the most Grand Tour stages of any rider this year, sprinter or otherwise. Now, perhaps another measure of success should be how well those riders did against each other. There are so many races on the UCI calendar these days that it's possible for riders to avoid each other completely for large parts of the season. So, head to head, which of these riders came out on top? Or in this situation, head to head to head to head to head. We calculated which riders beat the other riders most often and found that in a direct battle for a bunch sprint stage win, Caleb Ewan beat the others most often, coming out on top 13 times. But this stat goes hand in hand with the fact that 5 of his wins were Grand Tour stages, where the quality of the field is naturally higher. But all the more reason why he might be the best candidate for best sprinter of 2019. Dig a little bit deeper though, and it's possible to come up with a face-off percentage of how these riders win against their rivals versus how often they are defeated when bunch sprinting. Sam Bennett coming out on top with that particular measure, helped perhaps by the fact that he never faced Pascal Ackermann in a bunch sprint all year because they're teammates at Bora Hansgrohe. And indeed, neither of them had to face another mutual teammate, Peter Sagan. So it's not exactly crystal clear as to the right answer to the question of who the best sprinter was in 2019, but what does seem very clear is that the spread of bunch sprinting talent is a lot more evenly distributed than it was in the past. 6 different riders won a bunch sprint at the Tour de France this year. 4 that we've already mentioned, Ewan, Viviani, Groenewegen and Sagan, but also Mike Teunissen and Wout van Aert. Now it can be somewhat subjective to determine exactly what is and isn't a bunch sprint, but by our reckoning, it's the first time there have been 6 different bunch sprint winners at the Tour de France since 2007. And it's probably no coincidence that 2007 was the last year before Mark Cavendish started winning stages. Regardless of all the statistics and numbers, we'd like to know who you think was the best sprinter of 2019. Was it Groenewegen, Ewan, Viviani, Bennett or Ackermann? You can vote by using the poll that's on the GCN app, a link to which is in the description below. Or maybe you don't think it's any of the above, and in fact that it was Lorena Wiebes. She won 15 races this year, one of which was an overall GC win. Now admittedly, Marianne Vos did win more, but almost all of Wiebes' wins came in bunch sprints, and she really is the rider to beat in those finishes in 2020. We are going to go back to Cyclocross briefly now, and the Rectavit series, which moved to Sint Niklaas for round 3. 2018 winner Sanne Cant was back to defend her title, whilst many chose to sit this one out and save their legs for the Namur World Cup on the Sunday. Last year, there was one young rider who was catching the attention of the TV director, as she was one of a select few riders who were bunny hopping the plank section. Fast forward 12 months, and 20-year-old Aniek van Alphen from the Netherlands is starting to push the top riders with her technical ability. And not just any top riders, she was in a battle with the current world champion herself, Sanne Cant, pushing her all the way to the finish. She would eventually lose out to Cant in the sprint to the line, but that was a coming of age, wasn't it? And I have absolutely no doubt that her first big pro win is just around the corner. Mathieu van der Poel, Tom Pidcock and Quinten Hermans had made up the podium in the Dreven Cross in Overijse last Sunday, and in St Niklaas, they did so again. There's a famous section actually on that course, a steep bank that sweeps round and back up. It forces most of the riders to get off their bike and running back up. Now we've cast our minds back, and we can't remember another rider managing to stay on their bike on this section, but Tom Pidcock managed it. You could see the reaction actually from the other riders in that front group when the Trinity Racing man did it on the following lap, and they took notice, including Mathieu van der Poel, who then started to follow suit. Anyway, in the race itself, there was a mistake in the sand from Hermans, which momentarily delayed him and Pidcock, and that was enough to give the world champion the lead, and that was basically how it stayed. Hermans took 2nd place and Pidcock 3rd on the day. Now in other news, Jumbo Visma have already announced their Tour de France squad for 2020, something which I think is quite unprecedented. I can't remember the last time a team announced their definitive lineup so far out from the race. And it's risky in some ways because anything could happen to any of those 8 riders between now and July. But wow, what a lineup it is. Primoz Roglic, Tom Dumoulin and Steven Kruijswijk will be ably supported in the mountains by Robert Gesink, Laurens de Plus and Sepp Kuss, which leaves Tony Martin to beast it on the front on the flatter sections, and then Wout van Aert to, I don't know, go back and collect the bottles or something. I mean, I'm half joking about that, but that is actually what he himself has said. Anyway, it's an incredible looking team, and you've got to say it's the one that looks the most threatening to Team Ineos since they started dominating the Tour de France in 2012. That said, as a lot of people have already pointed out, that 3-pronged attack never really quite worked for Movistar, But let's hope that's not the case for Jumbo Visma. Regardless, that quest to win the Tour de France has come at the expense of their sprinter Dylan Groenewegen, which answers our question in fact from a couple of weeks back about how they combine their GC and sprint ambitions. And there's also no room for Mike Teunissen, who won a stage and took the yellow jersey this year. Steven Kruijswijk, incidentally, will also be heading to the Vuelta a España in 2020, where he will lead the team, and this is what he had to say about it.
Ja, afgelopen jaar helaas vroegtijdig de Vuelta moeten verlaten. Ja, daarvoor zat ik er dichtbij, dus ja, het is wel voor mij weer een goede kans en mogelijkheid om op het podium te komen in een grote ronde. Natuurlijk, elke grote ronde die in Nederland start, die heeft toch wat extra's voor ons als Nederlandse ploeg. Ja, ik denk dat dat een extra motivatie voor ons brengt, zeker nu met een ploegentijdrit begint. Wat een van onze sterkere wapens is tegenwoordig en ja, daar kunnen we gelijk voor de winst gaan.
The Vuelta is the last of the Grand Tours to reveal its route for 2020, but they did so last week, and as you might expect, it's brutal, with 8 summit finishes. It's almost hard to remember that time when this was seen as the easiest Grand Tour, when the riders got to enjoy a cheeky beer each evening. But the rumours were true about the inclusion of the Angliru, and also about the Col de Tourmalet, which comes on stage 9. There's also a really tough individual time trial to start the final week of the race. There are some stages for sprinters though, 7 to be precise, 2 of which, as you'd expect, are in the Netherlands, where the race will kick off. The race also visits Portugal for the first time in 23 years. Moving on, Pauline Ferran has said that she's no longer going to compete on the road. The former world champion, in pretty much every discipline, explains that she finds it the least enjoyable of all 3 disciplines in which she competes, and she's going to focus on mountain biking, with a big aim being the Olympics, and cyclocross, where she'll be starting to compete very soon. There she's going to aim to be selected to represent France at the World Championships in February. Speaking of cyclocross, unfortunately there will be no World Cup in Bern next year, despite the success of the event this year. The organisers pointed to an increase in the cost to put on a World Cup event after the UCI's recent reform of the series, which is supposed to go from 9 up to 16 rounds. And it's a real shame, I've got to say, because I very much enjoyed that round this year. There may also be no Swedish National Road Race Championships in 2020 due to the fact that new stricter rules say that roads are for cars and bike racing should take place on bike paths. Which sounds bizarre, but could have some very wide-reaching implications for road racing in Sweden. Team Ineos, not wanting to be outdone by Bahrain McLaren, have teamed up with Formula 1 squad Mercedes-AMG Petronas and the new Ineos sailing team, both with a view to collaboration and further performance development. And I wonder whether that's a trend which will become more and more prevalent in the coming years. We should wait and see. And finally, after last week's show, it was confirmed by Team UAE Emirates that Tadej Pogačar will ride the Tour de France next year, where he'll make his debut. And I really cannot wait to see how he gets on there. What a talent he is. Right, that is all for this week. Don't forget to tune in for our upcoming cyclocross coverage. They'll all be available as live if you can't catch them live, and we'll also have short highlights after each race too. We'll also be back here on the Racing News Show with a summary of them all this time next week. Happy Christmas everybody. Thank you all for your company this year and for your contributions to the GCN Racing channel. Bring on 2020, I say. I think it's going to be a good one. But now, for a race of a different kind, 2 teams on a tandem to Formentor in Mallorca. I absolutely love this video and you can find it just down here.